I had to narrow it down, it would be this, which is the Colosseum in Rome. And some of you, oh, so y'all been there, okay. Well, that's on my bucket list. I would love to go to Jerusalem. I'd love to see Israel. I'd love to go to modern-day Turkey, where Ephesus is, and all the missionary travels. But some of you have been in Italy. I would love to go to Rome. And it's a beautiful piece of architecture, of course, but a lot of church history in this place. A lot of Christians met their death at this place. So it is a sacred place only in the sense that it was something that the Apostle Paul saw, obviously with his own eyes, and that's pretty neat to think about. So if you think about all these different buildings, all right, if I could go anywhere, it would be Rome to see the Colosseum. Rome, in my view, Rome would not be Rome without the Colosseum. Okay, Egypt would not be Egypt without the pyramids. Okay, Paris would not be Paris without the Eiffel Tower. All right, get where I'm going with this? London. Some of you may have been to London. London would not be London without Big Ben, the clock right there. All right. I think, as we read Matthew 24, I think the disciples had a similar problem, which is what led them to ask these questions. For the disciples, Jerusalem could not be Jerusalem without the temple. Okay? This is why they're so concerned. This is why they're asking these questions. This is what Jesus is addressing. Yes, sir? Okay?
In Blythewood, if it wasn't for Cedar Creek Baptist Church, there wouldn't be a Blythewood.
I like that. That's right. That's good. Now, when I do my editing, I'm going to leave that on the video, okay? That's good. I like that. Yeah. Try to put yourself in the mindset of these disciples. This is such an earth-shattering piece of information to them. They can't imagine Jerusalem being the city of God, the place that it is, without the temple being there. And yet, Jesus says to them at the beginning of chapter 24, this place is going to be destroyed. Utterly destroyed. Not one stone is going to be left on top of the other, which is why the disciples asked those questions. When is this going to happen? Right? When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So that's where we started, and we want to just continue to make our journey through that. All right? So the disciples, Jesus said this, the disciples asked the questions, and so far, last week, Jesus responded with two things. You remember what they were? Don't be deceived. Don't be afraid. All right? That's how Jesus answered them. And so now we're gonna take another step, and that is, this is the passage that we're gonna look at tonight. All right. So notice with me, we're just picking up where we left off last week. This is Jesus speaking, verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and then there's this little parenthetical note here. Let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what's in his house. Let the one who's in his field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, or woe for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise. They will perform great signs and wonders or miracles, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, or behold, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. All right, so there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack. All right, when I was a little boy, I used to love those connect the dots puzzles. Y'all remember those? You get these little sheets, and there wouldn't be a. You still do those, and there wouldn't be an image on there, but you would start at number 1, right? And you would draw a line at number 2, and you draw a line at number 3. If you did that all the way around, you'd have an image. You'd have something there. All right. So what we're going to start doing tonight is kind of connecting the dots with a few things. All right. So there's going to be a picture. There's going to be some things that are going to start to become a little more clearer to us as we go. We won't finish it tonight, but as we sort of go through, especially this passage. Everything so far has been sort of introductory, right? To get us to this particular passage here and to understand what Jesus is talking about here. I think when you look at the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and Matthew 25, probably the most confusing or maybe the most mysterious part of this entire teaching is what Jesus talks about in verse 15. All right, which is this thing called the abomination of desolation. And what I want to do tonight is we sort of unpack this. We won't finish it tonight. We may come back to this at some point. I just want to unpack a little history. All right? I don't want this to turn into a history lesson tonight, but biblical history will often help us understand the Bible better. All right, so we may not, be able to understand or know all of that, but if we want to get a clearer picture of what this section is about, because it's really mysterious. Like, what in the world is he talking about here? Understanding a little bit of history, biblical history, will make this picture come a lot clearer to us. All right, so we just want to sort of dive into that a little bit. I think history is good whenever. It helps us understand the Bible. All right, so the first thing that we're going to start with is a temple timeline. On your handouts, you've got 4 headings. First temple, second temple, temple renovated, and temple destroyed. Now, there's room for you to write in some of this stuff that you're going to see. You don't have to. I know we got a few fill in the blanks, but it's there for you to just write a few things down. And I want to take you through, just for a few minutes, take you through a timeline that sheds some light on what Jesus is talking about here. All right, so I think it's going to help us do that. All right, so hopefully you can see this. I tried to make it as big as possible. So the first thing we think about is the first temple. This was the temple built by King Solomon in the year 960 BC. 1 Kings chapter 6, 1 Kings chapter 7. Okay, so we're not going to go into the details of that, but the first temple was built, not by David, but by Solomon in 960, and it was absolutely beautiful. If you want to know more about this first temple, go read 1 Kings 6 and 7. All right, all the details are in that. All right, so that happened in 960 BC, and then in 586, the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and destroyed that temple. That temple was gone. All right. About 70 years later, this is during the exile, during Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that era of Israelite history, they were in exile for 70 years. They came out of exile and under a guy named Zerubbabel. And if I had another baby, that might be a consideration for a name. Call him BB. All right, Zerubbabel. All right. That's right. That's right. So he and through Nehemiah and Ezra, they rebuilt a second temple, and it was smaller than the first. It wasn't as extravagant as the first temple, but they rebuilt it. And they were able, in 516, they were able to have this temple in Jerusalem, and that existed up until 20 BC, 20 years before Jesus was born. Now, It's in this second temple, in the history of this second temple, that something happened that sheds some light on what Jesus is talking about in verse 15. All right. Again, I know I don't want this to kind of to confuse us, but I want us to track through this. There is something that happened in the year 167 BC that was referred to as the abomination of desolation. That there was a guy, a Seleucid king, named Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was from out of Greece. He invaded Jerusalem, didn't destroy the temple, but he killed a bunch of Jews, and he committed some very disturbing and blasphemous things in the temple, in this temple. 167. Okay, that's part of Jewish history. It's part of Greek history. Like that's not something that that's in any question. And we'll talk about what he did. But that happened. That's an historical event that happened in 167. This guy Antiochus Epiphanes, and Daniel references this in those 3 verses, and I included those 3 verses on your handouts, so you don't have to look them up, or you can go and read them later in the scriptures, but that's what the red writing is right there. That is what happened. We'll talk about specifically what happened in 167. Okay? So after that, the temple continued on, and then the temple was renovated under Herod the Great in 20 BC. 20 years before Jesus, the temple was renovated. And remember last week we spent some time, we looked at an animation of what the temple looked like when Herod renovated it. That's the temple of Jesus' day. This temple that was renovated in 20 BC, that's the temple Jesus is talking about being destroyed. Okay, so this is the temple of the days of Jesus. All right? So, temple renovated, 20 BC, then sort of on that timeline, you see the cross. There's the crucifixion. So that's around 33, 35, 37 AD. All right? The cross represents when Jesus was crucified. And then 40 years after this verse. Okay? So let's try to step back about 2,000 years, put ourselves in this text on the Mount of Olives, listening to Jesus. When Jesus spoke these words in verse 15, 40 years later, the temple was destroyed by a Roman emperor named Titus. Okay? Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but this is gives us some context for what Jesus is talking about. There is a sense in which Jesus has some historical perspective in verse 15 about the abomination of desolation, and then there is something that is going to happen. There is something that is going to happen in the lifetime of the disciples. Okay? So just try to get, I'm not going to ask you to remember all this. I just want you to see the timeline of what is happening, especially the last part of that graphic, which is the destruction of the temple that Jesus prophesied and predicted in verse 1. That's the temple that he's talking about. Okay? That's going 40 years from when he spoke this, the temple was going to be destroyed. All right? Again, that gives us a little bit of context. Now, I want to leave that up there, and I want you to look at your handouts and look at the 3 scriptures in Daniel that reference this right here. The abomination of desolation in Daniel. Okay, again, you don't have to turn there. Put it on your handouts for you. Daniel 9:27. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. All right, we read that one verse out of Daniel 9, and we're going, what in the world is Daniel talking about? Again, Daniel 11:31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. Daniel 12:11. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, which is 3.5 years and 15 days. That's what 1,290. Now, obviously, there's some eschatology here, right? There's some stuff going on in Revelation. There's some things that are happening that sort of push us to the future. Because we're thinking, wait, Antichrist, 1,290 days, that's 3.5 years, 7 years of tribulation, first 3.5. All right, so that's sort of pushing us into the future. But I want to sort of resist the urge to jump into eschatology and just stay in the text. Remember when we started, I said, this is not a study of eschatology. This is a study of Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. So we just want to stay right there. So I know you had the urge to jump into Revelation. Let's sort of put that off to the side for a minute and just stay right here. All right? So what is happening in Daniel 9, Daniel 11, and Daniel 12 that is referenced here by this king that invaded the temple in Jerusalem? What was it that was so grievous and so blasphemous and so profane that it was considered an abomination of desolation? Here's what happened. Antiochus came in, brought his army in, and came into Jerusalem. And instead of destroying the temple, he did some incredibly blasphemous things to mock the faith and beliefs of the Jews. Part of the Jewish religious system was that pork was off limits. It was considered an unclean animal, and Jews were not allowed to have anything to do, couldn't eat, couldn't touch it, couldn't do anything with that. It made them ritually and ceremonially unclean. It was just a filthy animal that God had said nothing, it wanted his people nothing to do with. So Antiochus, in a very provocative move, brought pigs into the temple. He brought pigs into the holy place. And he slaughtered a bunch of pigs and dumped their blood all over the temple inside where the Jews worshipped. And then he made the priests who were there, I don't want to get so graphic with this, but he made the priests who were there kneel, and he made them eat the flesh of pigs in the temple. Now, for the Jews, that was worse than death. That was the most profane, the most blasphemous thing that they could ever imagine. And that is a recorded fact of history that every Jew and every disciple knew about. We may not have known about that when we started reading Matthew 24. But every Jew in Jerusalem knew this. And so when Jesus says the phrase, abomination of desolation, what did they think about? They went right there. They went right there. For the disciples, they didn't go in the future. When the disciples heard this, they went in the past. Because they knew what Daniel wrote about, and they knew what Jesus was referencing. They knew their history. This was one of the darkest days of Jewish history. It was an awful, awful thing. It led to a war, the Maccabean revolt. And there was, of course that was a little bit later, but there was this huge uprising because of what Antiochus did in the temple. This the most blasphemous thing that they could think about. The point is, the disciples went back in time to the history of when that happened in Daniel. All right, or when that happened in 167 that Daniel prophesied about. All right, so Jesus brings up this phrase. The disciples hear it And they connect that phrase to Daniel, to this event that happened in 167. All right? And then, this is the beauty of Jesus' teaching. There are multiple things happening at once. We have a timeline that we go from here to there, but there are multiple realities, there are multiple things that Jesus is addressing. And we'll end up with that. I think it'll make a whole lot of sense when we get to the end of this. But what Jesus is doing in this particular passage from verse 15, we just read it, all the way to verse 28, that he's predicting another abomination of desolation, like this one, that's going to happen in the future, which it did 40 years from the moment that Jesus spoke this. Titus came in and destroyed the temple. He set up all kinds of things. He didn't do the kinds of things that Antiochus did, but he did all kinds of profane things in the temple. And Titus, the emperor, was the fulfillment of Jesus' prediction. Not one stone is going to be left on top of the other. And that happened 40 years after Jesus said this. All right? I think this is what Jesus means in verse 28. All right? I don't think this is a stretch. There are all kinds of things happening here. But I think this is what Jesus meant in verse 28 when he said, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, look at your Bibles in verse 28. Does anybody have another word other than vultures? Okay? Kind of a big difference between an eagle and a vulture. It is the word eagle. Okay? Atai is the Greek word there, atai. It is the word eagle. So where the corpse is, where the desolation is, there the eagles are going to gather. Now, when you look at Titus's army, the Roman army in the first century in AD 70, every garrison, every group of soldiers, they took with them a standard, something called a standard, a big banner that they would hold up, and they would go into whatever city that they were going into to conquer. And at the top of every banner was this eagle. And when Titus came into the temple in AD 70, they brought the banners with the eagles into the inner room of the temple, and they set up a shrine to worship Jupiter, which is Zeus, which is their god, in the middle of the temple where God is worshipped. Titus set up an altar to worship a false god.
Was this in the Holy of Holies type, the inner sanctuary?
It was in the inner sanctuary. Mm-hmm. Yep. Of course, the ark wasn't there at that time, but yeah, that was the inner. There was a larger room in the middle, and this sort of behind that curtain, was the Holy of Holies. So yeah, it was. We don't know exactly where it was, but it was that inner area where they went. The point is, the Romans would find the most holy of places to the Jews, and that's where they would profane the most. That's where they would. And so this was something that happened that Jesus, I believe, and this is a little cryptic verse here, this reference to verse 28. What in the world is he talking about here? But I think he has on his mind sort of the past abomination of desolation, and for the disciples in their lifetime, there's going to be another one. And 40 years after he spoke this, that happened. All right, so there's this connection that's going on here. So I think Jesus is referencing this Roman army that's bringing their false gods into the temple in 70 AD. All right, so that's a whole lot of information. Here's what I want to do. I want to try to connect some dots and just kind of summarize a few things, all right? Because there's a lot to think about, and I want to stay right here because there's so many other things in this text that we're not really dealing with tonight. We're just mainly trying to understand what is this idea of abomination of desolation. But here's where everything starts to come together. This is on your handouts, all right? There is an historic view in this text, verses 15 through 28. Jesus is referencing something in history. Okay, so there's an historic view that is happening here. And then there is a present day view. Because 40 years from speaking this, in the lifetime of the disciples, the temple is going to be destroyed, and Titus is going to come in and set up his false gods in the temple. So there is a present day reality, but, and this is what I love about how Jesus, or what Jesus is doing here, there is a futurist view, okay, that affects the church, that is going to happen in the future. So there is a past reality, a present day reality, and there's something here that is pointing not just to the disciples, but to you and I. There's something that's beyond, that really hasn't happened yet. All of this is like a braid. It's like a rope that's been, these three realities that are woven together. And it's more than just some historical event that's happening here. So there's, a lot of prophecy about the Antichrist. And of course, we know that the scriptures teach that the Antichrist is going to establish a covenant with Israel. It's going to last for 7 years. He's going to break that covenant in the middle of that 7 years, which is 3.5 years. And that, the Antichrist, whoever that, now we're talking about future. All right. So there will be an Antichrist who will commit or do something just as profane to the extent that it will be referred to as an abomination of desolation. There is something that's going to happen in the future in the temple that's going to be rebuilt. And we don't know when that is, but there's talk about it in the culture today. You hear, if you pay attention to stuff that's going on in Jerusalem, there are people talking about red heifers, and they're talking about the Messiah, and they're talking about a third temple. They already have coins minted that they are producing that has an image of the temple that they want to build. They're already printing that. Of course, there's no building taking place yet, but that's something that's going to happen in the future. But Jesus here is saying that event, which would have been blasphemous, the abomination of desolation in 167 BC, and this that's going to happen in their lifetime, this temple that's going to be destroyed, Jesus is saying that those two things are just a foretaste, a shadow of something that's going to happen even more in the future. Okay, so all these realities are taking place at the same time. So the first prophecy, and this is where we want to kind of land a little bit tonight. The first prophecy in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 concerns simply just the coming destruction of Jerusalem. That's what he's referencing. The coming destruction of Jerusalem, which is going to be roughly 40 years from this. All right, so, a lot to take in, and I want to finish with a few summary questions. All right, just as a way to drive home this timeline, because if we can get this and kind of understand these things that are happening all at once, then the rest of chapter 24 and especially the parables of chapter 25 are going to make a whole lot more sense to us if we understand the context of what Jesus is talking about. All right, so some very simple questions, all right, to kind of think through a little bit as we leave. These are yes or no questions, could the desecration of the temple in 167 BC, could that be viewed as an act or something that could be seen as an abomination of desolation? The answer to that is yes. It's not the abomination of desolation that Jesus is prophesying about, but that event could be viewed as, yes, that is an abomination of desolation. Second thing, when Jesus refers to the abomination of desolation here in chapter 24 in the Olivet Discourse, is he talking about just the past events of 167 BC? And the answer to that is no. Right? It's in the minds of the disciples, it's in their history, but in this passage, Jesus is not talking about something that's already happened. Right? He's predicting something that will happen. We see that in the language. Like, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Pray that it's not, your flight may not be in winter or the Sabbath. Like, he's talking about something in the future. So this event isn't just something that we can look at and go, oh, that's already happened. Because Jesus is looking at a future event, okay? So he's predicting an event that's going to happen in the future, not something simply that happened in the past. All right, here's a third question. Could Jesus be predicting the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70? And we've covered that, yes. Yes, that could be what verse 15 is all about. Not something necessarily connected to our view of eschatology, but Jesus is predicting something that will happen in 40 years, and you and I sitting here tonight reading this, it already happened 2,000 years ago. All right, so that's a possibility as well. So it's obvious, though, that in this discourse, in this teaching, that some of what Jesus says here is going to happen to the disciples that he's talking to. Some of these things he's predicting is going to happen to these men sitting there listening to him. But some of this stuff is going to happen to some future disciples too. There's two groups affected here. These men that are sitting there with him, but also the future disciples in the church as well. So here's this where we're living at in church history and redemptive history. We are living in the in-between. It's something called inaugurated eschatology. Okay? And don't get confused by those. That's a good way to think about. Inaugurated means it's already started. And eschatology is the study of end times. The end times have already started. All right? And so we are living in the already but not yet season of redemptive history. To me, that's the most exciting time you could be. And I'd love to have been in the first century and seen Jesus with my own eyes. I fear, as I read the scriptures, I fear that I would have been one of those that didn't recognize him. That it was right in front of my face and I didn't, so I'm glad that I was born where I am. We are living in the age of the church age that has already started, but it hasn't ended yet. So, inaugurated eschatology, the already, but not yet. So, some of what Jesus said here has already happened, but not all of it. Okay? So that's a great way to kind of think about this. And last thing I think I wanted you to fill out, as was his custom. That just means that Jesus did this all the time. Jesus could have been addressing both a present-day reality and a future event. And this is what happens in the book of Revelation. Revelation gets so confusing to us because we think, there's one timeline. There's one, chronological timeline that's happening from start to finish. And the book of Revelation will come alive to you when you realize there are several going on all at once. And it's just beautiful to see. Jesus is referencing a present-day reality. This is true for these disciples. But he's also referencing a coming event, a future event as well. All right, so this is where we'll end up. This is our last slide. Just a good way to think about this. The abomination of desolation has already happened. It happened in 167 BC. It will happen in the disciples' lifetime, which happened in AD 70. And it's going to happen a third time, or another time in the future, in the third and final temple, whenever that is, and then Jesus will return based on your belief about the rapture, and we'll cover some of that stuff as well. But this is very helpful, to, at least for me, to realize that there's not just this mysterious thing that we should just, gloss over and, well, I don't know what that is. No, we can understand what the abomination of desolation is. We can sort of get a 3D image of that, right? We can see the past reference to that. We can see the present reality for those disciples, and we can see that it's going to come, in the future as well. It may not be in our lifetimes, but it could be. Okay? So, good. I know that's a lot of information, but I think it's very helpful. Any comments, any questions, anything you want to mention before we go?